Good evening and welcome for being with us today, and also to the online audience. I want to apologize for the conference that was scheduled last week, but the speaker could not arrive on time due to family issues, and she apologizes. Nonetheless, today we're going to discuss different topics. We are going to continue with our seminar. I have the pleasure of introducing the members of the panel today. Pablo Martín-Aceña, a very well-known person in the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, and Paloma de la Nuez. They're very well known, so I'm going to introduce them very briefly. Pablo Martín-Aceña is a professor of history and economic institutions at the University of Alcalá. He was trained and educated abroad. He was visiting professor at 8 or 10 universities, including Cambridge, La Sorbonne in France, Mexico, etc. He has published more than a dozen books on the matter. Paloma de la Nuez, our second speaker, works in my area. She specializes in political theory. She's an expert on the history of political thoughts. She's our number one expert on liberalism, especially in what is known today as neoliberalism. Hayek and others are good examples. And recently, she's been analyzing the work of Hannah Arendt. The topic of discussion is liberty or freedom and solidarity, the challenges of the new inequalities. The idea is to provide a framework for the discussion of the problem, to determine to what extent it is a severe problem, and also the compatibility of two concepts, freedom and liberty. Well, Pablo, you have probably a more technical approach to that of Paloma, so you go first. If that's okay with you? No, ladies first. Okay, Paloma. You can just make your presentations, 20 minutes each, and then we can open the floor for discussion. Good evening, and I would like to thank the Institución Libre de Enseñanza. Thank you, Fernando Vallespín. It's a great honor for me to have been invited. Well, I just wanted to thank the Institución and Fernando. It's, of course, a great pleasure. It's an honor, and it's a great opportunity to meet old friends and to make new friends. So I'm going to follow up on some of the topics that were discussed during the first cycle, the first version of the cycle, and inequalities, the citizens' unhappiness, and I will also refer to one of the scholars on the topic, and I will also quote some authors which are experts in the world of political, in the topic of political theory. Of course, 20 minutes is not enough to discuss all of these topics at length, so maybe we can discuss them further during the Q&A. Liberal democracies are in crisis. There are many books published in Spain recently with titles such as How Democracies Die, This is How Democracy Ends, The Shrinking Democracy, The Path to Freedom, just to name a few. Democracy is a danger. That seems to be the common threat to all of them. The good old times are over, and the state is subject to forces that prevent it from growing. In Juan José Smith, The Breakdown of Democracy, he says that one of the reasons for the crisis of democracy is the loss of legitimacy, which occurs when democracy is not efficient when it comes to solve problems, when they cannot implement the policies that were considered as necessary. And one of these necessary policies is the reduction of inequality. Nowadays, citizens think that inequalities have not decreased, on the contrary, they have increased due to ideologies and neoliberal policies that have been in place since the 80s. Even though the term neoliberal is misleading because it is used so often that it no longer explains inequalities, everyone who hears the term thinks about a capitalist system with no barriers that favors privatizations, deregulation, reduction of public expenditure, the welfare state. All of these is the cause of the liberal process that has reduced communitary solidarity and has brought about the loss of solidarity principles. It was believed that without economic independence, it is impossible to achieve individual freedom. Economic freedom would bring about greater growth, progress, innovation. It would not eliminate all of the inequalities, though, but it would reduce them considerably. These inequalities would never be final. Freedom, open markets, and competition would prevent that from happening. However, the expectations are apparently not met nationally or internationally, because the liberals thought that economic liberalism would bring about political openness and democracy to the rest of the world as well as peace. This has not been realized, but if these measures were applied, a society would be created without middle classes. Since Aristotle, we know that the middle classes are the backbone of democracy. The best government is that where the class that has enough wealth is numerous, because when some have a lot and others have not, this creates riots among citizens, and when the poor are too numerous, the failure appears and democracies disappear. So if only for utilitarian and pragmatic reasons, middle-class society is the best alternative, because when there's a great inequality, corruption, and crime reign, if middle classes no longer trust the system, this is a serious problem. One of the symptoms of the lack of confidence is that it is no longer believed that effort or talent or virtue would be rewarded by society. That's why the debate on meritocracy is another of the topics in political discussion. No matter how hard you try and how much talent you have, the starting conditions determine compliance of the objectives that we have set for ourselves. and whoever does not achieve its goals, their goals, is responsible for their failure. This causes resentment among citizens, which do not see themselves as equal. And the citizens believe that the elites are far removed from the citizens. Liberalism is considered as profoundly conservative and elitist, which outrages those who feel humiliated by the very elites that they wish to be recognized. And that's not all. The citizens believe that the state has forsaken their individuals in a global, hostile, and competitive market, and that the societies where they live is increasingly unjust. Pierre de Saint-Ballon said that many have stopped believing in the welfare state, which has become some sort of state that provides assistance to the poor. Since realities have changed, the middle classes do not reap the benefits, only those who are most in need, not the rich either, because they don't need it. So this does away with the principle of reciprocity. In conclusion, the middle classes of liberal classes believe that they have been fooled and betrayed because they have not met their legitimate expectations. Heinz Bude says that the insensitivity towards security grows as security grows. And the same applies to inequalities. Maybe the middle class is used to an ordinary life and has promoted the mirage that the world is a predictable and benign place, which is not the case. Nonetheless, we should consider how much inequalities can a democracy tolerate and what are its effects. The effects or the consequences of inequalities can be summarized in three: social, political, and emotional or psychological. As to the social and political effect, there are two ways of understanding democracy: as a peaceful method of electing a representative, or as a way of living, of sharing the lives, which does not require full equality but a necessary degree of equality. But today, people feel excluded from that social link, a social bond. And one of the causes for that is inequality, because as contemporary political theory states, inequalities isolate, divide, and polarize people. In societies with a great inequality, the lifestyle is not shared, is not common. Schools, vehicles are not the same. And this undermines the principle of equality. Without shared experiences, it is difficult for citizens to identify themselves and to connect with others with whom they have nothing in common. Another effect of inequality is the delegitimation of the democratic systems, especially among the young, the youth. This creates unhappiness, which is capitalized by those who want to and the system, because when the individuals are fear, they look for a savior. So, in view of our actual and complex problems, more efficient alternatives are sought than those that the democracy can offer. Therefore, the only democracy that was possible was based on liberal principles. That is a belief that is no longer applicable. It might be more interesting to focus on the psychological consequences of inequality. Many scholars have said that inequalities have a devastating psychological effect on individuals, especially among the weakest, because the differences in status separate us not only socially but emotionally as well, because inequality favors abuse, injustice, and cruelty among human beings. No one is cruel with those he recognizes as equal. Obviously, inequality makes a lot of citizens feel humiliated, and human beings need the recognition of their dignity, being considered as useful and equal. And this and there's a lot of fear of society. Social changes bring about emotional changes. We live in very fast change times. Fear seems to be the prevailing global political emotion. There's a lot of literature about fear. Some say that this climate of pessimism and defeatism would be did increase with 9/11. Others think that that was an outcome of the crisis of the financial system. But there is a boom of utopias in cinema and literature, which really shed a lot of light about the current situation. In the 18th century, it was not dystopia, but utopia that was in fashion, because there was a very optimistic outlook about the future. Among the causes for this fear: climate change, international terrorism, artificial intelligence, nuclear war. The fear of the future is the prevailing fear. The loss of status, the social exclusion, all of this is connected to inequality, and of course, the sensation of losing control about our own lives. Insecurity and danger has a very negative impact on solidarity, as we see with the treatment given to immigrants and refugees, because fear is fear of the others. Fear is not solidarity. So how can we promote solidarity in such a situation? Well, solidarity should be understood as a civic virtue, which entails feeling responsible for your fellow citizens. And this is related to the form of government. Some believe that there's a clear relationship between the citizens and the form of government. And the type of government, in turn, has an effect on the character of citizens and vice versa. Living under a democratic liberal regime should have a healthy effect on the citizens, because freedom should have pedagogic effects. So a citizen in a democratic regime would understand that our moral choices not only have private consequences but also political. He would understand that if he does not care about injustice, when he does nothing, when he could have done something, he's been tacitly unjust. So he would be collaborating to injustice and would be preventing solidarity. It's not, it's not that citizens must be heroes or saints. It just be they have to be vigilant and behave with political dignity. A civil, strong society requires citizens to be informed. Information technology, in principle, in theory, would contribute to inform the citizens, but this has not been the case before. New technologies, there was already talk about the apathy and indifference of many citizens who, for many reasons, corruption, etc., just shied away from the political life and focused on their private lives, as if democracy was none of their business. And many proposals arose as a result of these. I'm going to focus the proposals focused on the cultivation of virtues and civic liberties, such as that of Mata Nussbaum, Príncipe Asturias Award winner, who says that we must cultivate some emotions like compassion or hospitality, which would lead us to a cosmopolitan society, because solidarity should exceed national frontiers and should cross them. And these should be financed by the state. Judith Esclar is much more skeptical, and she mistrusts the state. She thinks that it's the institutions or the laws, the ones that should promote good conduct of the behavior of the citizens. She does not believe that solidarity is spontaneous. That's why it is necessary to educate civic conduct, respectful with institutions and with the rule of law that can help put up proposals to change institutions, to incorporate greater participation of the citizens, or the creation of a shared civic space. But she underlines the need to listen to the voice of the marginalized, of the losers, not because they're always right, but rather because knowing more about the personal experiences of injustice provides a very insightful knowledge about what a just society should be. Both authors emphasize the role of culture because it educates emotions. Thanks to participation, we participate in the experiences of others. So this can help us make us more solidary. But these proposals are not free of problems. If the state would be responsible for this emotional education, the state could indoctrinate citizens about how we should live, how we should feel. Then this would be too patronizing for our liberty. Lord Althorn said that the state cannot make men good, but they can easily make men bad. Maybe this overemphasis of emotion would undermine the role of reason in the political life with a dangerous sentimentalization of politics. A committed citizenship sounds fine, but there are risks because this can lead to bigotry and fanatism. The solidarity of small groups could run against a more broad form of solidarity. So it's easier to make a diagnosis of what is going on than to propose solutions. But if we think that the only possible democracy is the one based on democratic principles, we should reformulate those principles, recover the principles of a liberal tradition, and renew those tenets that need to be adapted to the current times. It's not the first time that liberalism is in crisis. Liberal democracies are more prone to crisis than others. Emotions can also serve to help us understand what is it that we really value, what is really important. Norberto Legner from Chile said, fears speak about ourselves. As some psychologists say, individuals fear more what they are afraid of losing. We fear losing what we take for granted. So this fear could be a stimulus, a very useful emotion to renew democracy. Maybe the most interesting aspect is that fear can bring citizens outside of their indifference. Finally, democracy needs to be defended by its citizens who are very critical of their political representatives. They have every right to do so, but they are not so critical with themselves as citizens. We want the benefits of democracy, but we are not willing to do a lot for it. And democracy requires a loyalty to survive. That is a clear lesson we've learned. Well, thank you, Paloma. Fear is an important part of your presentation. Pablo, well, first of all, I want to thank the Institución Libre de Enseñanza and Fernando Vallespín for having invited me to participate in this very interesting cycle of conferences. I would like to thank also José García Velasco. Even though he is aware of my ignorance, he has been daring enough to invite me to this event. Well, I'm going to take a different approach to that of Paloma, even though there is some overlap between her presentation and mine. She's absolutely right, by the way. Everything she said, it's true. I'm going to raise a few questions during my presentation. First, then I'm going to talk about whether the world is more unequal or less unequal. Do we have more or less inequality? Finally, I'm going to mention a recent author, Galland, from the US, who says that inequality is a mystery. We don't know why inequality happens. And there is not one single reason for inequality. There's a set of different reasons, a combination of very mysterious reasons, if you like. When we talk about inequality, what do we mean? Are we referring to inequality among people or inequality among countries? It's not the same. Does this refer to inequality of wealth or inequality in income? A greatest inequality is between the employed and the unemployed, those who have a job and those who do not. So, when there is unemployment, of course, inequality increases. When everybody has a job, inequality decreases. How do we measure that? We have the Corrado-Gini index that says that when the indicator is 0 is full equality, and when the index is at 1, the inequality is maximum. Inequality has always existed. The world has never been a Gini 0. It's always been a Gini index between 0 and 1. Has inequality decreased with time? Does economic growth generate greater or lesser inequality? Why do we mean by the term new inequality that has been coined by Fernando Vallespin? Is inequality a problem apart from an ethical problem? In the first conference of this cycle, you said that inequality is a threat for democracy, and Paloma has said the same. It's a risk, it's a present and future risk. Even though it's not the only risk, she mentioned climate change, globalization, etc. So we should wonder, is inequality really a problem? Should we make efforts to correct it, to fix it? Why is there inequality when it shouldn't exist? But it's not the economy's fault, because in an open world, in a world without barriers, the movements of capital and labor would tend towards equality of income due to the economic law of decreasing yield. So the capital would move from those countries where there's an abundance of capital to the countries in which there is no such abundance. And the workers would then go, or rather the employers would use cheap labor. So there would be a migration of labor according to this reality. Law ensures equal income, equality of income. The problem is that there is no full mobility of capital and labor. It's Lucas' famous paradox. If the world was open with no obstacles, the workers, labor and capital would go to the most profitable places, locations. If this is what economic theory predicts, the classical and neoclassical theory, why does inequality occur? In the book, The Journey of Humankind, this is one of the ideas that is proposed. Has inequality worsened or improved? In 1970, 40% of the world population lived with less than $1 a day. In the year 2000, only 25%. That's a lot of people that it's only 25%. 60% live with less than $2 a day in 1970. In the year 2000, 50%. In 2010, 40%. A lot of people indeed, but poverty has decreased, as we can see from those figures. Another positive piece of information, average life expectancy for 30 years from 1820 to 1850. In 1990, 60 years. I know we have a life expectancy of 80, but in Spain, but the world's average is 60, so people live longer. However, has inequality increased or decreased, and why? The UN says that in the last 30 years, more than 1 billion people have abandoned poverty. Nonetheless, the part of the income that corresponds to the half population, the half of the population that is poorer, has hardly changed. So the world is much richer, but the distribution of income has not improved. It has not worsened either, but it has not improved. Let me give you some figures from a few authors. Thomas Piketty, for instance, in his book Capital in the 20th Century, he says the world of the years 2021, no matter how unjust we perceive it, is much more egalitarian than that of 1950, 1900, or 1850, for that matter. Inequality must not conceal the fact that the trend towards equality has been constant. Between 1850, well, I'm an economic historian, 1850 and 1900 and 1970, all of the indexes improved from 0.8, a lot of inequality, down to 0.7, 0.6, 0.5. There are differences among continents and among countries, of course. However, inequality index has improved. Nonetheless, after 1980, from 1980 onwards, inequality has increased, and in others, it has become stable. In Europe, inequality is 0.3. We live in a continent of the rich, and this is where we find the realities that Paloma has described. In Europe is where we perceive that there is a greater inequality. Why don't we ask the Asians or the Africans whether they think that the problem is inequality or growth? Because so long as societies grow, inequality will not disappear, but it will decrease. The periods of economic decrease is when unemployment grows and inequality increases. Of course, between 1914 and 1980, this is called the period of the Great Redistribution. In Europe, in the States, and practically all over the world, inequality decreased. And this is the time when the welfare state idea was created, because the states could collect more taxes from a growing economy, and they could finance the welfare state. When economy is not growing, the taxes collected of course, decrease, and of course, this is detrimental for inequality because it creates imbalances. However, the same author says that the trend towards the redistribution of income and towards a greater equality progressed in parallel to freedom and democracy. He says that democracy and freedom go hand in hand with the process of growing equality. Growth equals equality. He also says that since 1980, inequalities have not increased or decreased. The trend is towards greater inequality among individuals. What does, and he explains it in the following way. He thinks that there has been a distribution in favor of capital against labor. Income has benefited capital and not labor, and that is the key to the growing inequality since 2007. What does Milanovic says about it? What does he have to say about it? He mentions Simon Kuznets, a Russian economist who lived in the US, who talked about a U-shaped curve. Initially, societies are very similar because there is a percentage of very wealthy population, but the rest are very poor. When growth starts, especially after the industrialization of the 19th century, inequalities increase until down to a point after which the distribution of income and wealth increase. And this is a shape, the U-shape that the European societies have gone through, and Asian and Africa's economy are just going through the same U-shaped curve, but they have not caught up with Europe yet. Of course, it took Europe 200 years to get to the bottom of the U and start rising, which has not been the case yet with Africa and Asia. There are many data, but I'm not going to overwhelm you with data. The Gini index that I have mentioned before that measures inequality has been questioned because it only measures economic activity. The UN in 1992 proposed the idea that in order to measure inequality, we had to build a human development index. And this index was built by several researchers, one of whom is Leandro Prados de la Escosura, who's just published a splendid book about the evolution of this index. And this index takes into account several indicators: GDP, education, life expectancy, reduction of children's mortality, health, food, the weight of the state in the economies, and democracy and freedom. So this Human Development Index is a function of all these variables. And the result, or the conclusion drawn by Leandro Prados de la Escosura, is that inequality from 1900 to 1990, measured through this index of human development, has decreased. In other words, it has improved, no matter which index we use to measure it. Until 1990, it's not that it has just reversed this positive evolution, it's just stopped its evolution. So democracy, liberalism, this market system, capitalism, does not ensure or guarantee that we are going to be better. At least this is what the rich think. This is what we think in Western Europe. We don't know what others think about this. Now, I'm going to, well, I've mentioned all of these figures, all of these different indexes, because there's no consensus. Some use the Gini index, others use the Human Development Index. In summary, my conclusion is that until the end of the 20th century, societies have evolved towards a greater equity. As Gallo says, there is some mystery about inequality. Why does inequality exist? Ethnical, geographical reasons. It's not the same living in a meadow full of rivers than living inside the sub-Saharan Africa. There are all sorts of questions, ethnical, geographical, for reasons of the diversity of the population, exploitation, colonialism, and then there are cultural and institutional factors, values, norms, beliefs, preferences, religion, etc. So whereas Marx and the Marxists said that the key of inequality was exploitation, the use of violence, that tendency to, or exploitation through an increase in the capital gains, whereas the economists, non-Marxist economists, but not necessarily neoliberal, think that it is very complicated to search for the reasons for inequality. Why the levels of inequality in France and Spain were quite different until very recently. UN. In Spain, the famous Gini index in 2020 stands at 0.34. Very unequal. Well, the world average is 0.6. It ranges from 0.6 to 0.7. However, we perceive that we live in a very unequal world. In France, in 2020, the Gini index is 0.33, 0.31 in Germany, 0.36 in Italy. In other words, they're all very close to each other, as you can see. I'd like to mention Amartya Sen, who published a book named Development and Freedom, and he connects the two. He says that development is the process of expansion of freedom. He says that we can measure development through GDP or through the Human Development Index, but he thinks that growth is a means to expand liberties and to increase the capacity of choice. And he says that economic development is the source that eliminates the obstacles to freedom, poverty, lack of opportunities, lack of or scarcity of public services. And then he lists basic freedoms: participation, political participation, free market that allows people to mobilize from one place to another and to trade, the capacity of choice, and enjoying security. Therefore, he connects basic freedoms with economic development, even though he admits that freedom is the number one priority and it's the most important aspect in itself. And then he adds something that has really caught my attention. What is the priority? Let's assume that the world is unequal. There is inequality between countries. By the way, inequality between countries increase, but inequality inside the countries has decreased because there are two different forces. Inequality between the European Union and China has increased in the last 100 years, despite the fact that China has grown considerably. However, inequality within each of the countries of the European Union has improved. Even though, as I've said before, this has stabilized, this improvement, since 1980, 1990. But he wonders, what is the priority for a democracy: to eradicate poverty, fight against inequality, or to guarantee political freedoms and human rights? Well, it's a dilemma, really. He thinks it can be resolved, but it's a dilemma after all. He says there are people for and against each. It depends on who you ask. If you ask someone in a poor society, the response would probably be to eradicate poverty, and then we will talk about freedom. Or, as Lenin said, freedom, what for? In a society like Spain, or in a European society, European Union society, the response is not so clear. Should we eradicate poverty and inequality, or should we defend democracy and freedom? These two have gone hand in hand in the past, maybe not anymore. The more democracy, the more freedom. The more development, the less, the more equality. Of course, I'm not resolving anything. I know, I'm aware of that, but I don't think I was supposed to resolve any problem. I just giving you some food for thought, hopefully, and that's all from me, Fernando. Thank you. Well, I think we have a lot of topics to discuss. We'll take a few questions from the floor and then from the online audience. And you can ask questions from each other as well, and I would like to say a few words myself at the end. Good evening. Sister, Paloma's sister, by the way. I would like to make a comment. I would like to focus the topic on the situation in Spain. Well, Pablo, you've given us a lot of indicators, but there's a perception that inequality is growing, especially among the younger generations. As to the debate on pensions, the reform of pensions is at the expense of the new generations, and this is something that all data confirm. Nonetheless, apparently, this is accepted as a given. And by the way, the younger citizens are the ones who are more disappointed by democracy because I think they believe that there is a greater inequality, that those who have more privileged and favor, and they will have a worse life than their parents. So the question is, what type of proposals could we make to the young generations who feel that they don't have they don't have a great relevance in democracy, and politicians do not really tend to their needs, or when they do, they don't think they have enough capacity to reverse the process and to make these reforms. So that's what I wanted to ask, because I think we should focus on the situation in Spain. Well, I want to follow up on what the lady has just said, because there is some sort of a schizophrenia among the figures. Well, figures can be manipulated. Well, what is not really changing is the perception of people about these realities. Well, of course, the lady has mentioned the point of view of the youth. I could give you the point of view of those like me who take care, who are professionally dedicated to the cities. Because, for instance, there is a clear growth in our cities of slums, which is a clear indication of the growth in suffering, in poverty, because the slums are growing. In Africa, we see unprecedented slums and in some countries this has become a chronic problem. The speaker has mentioned a few authors who said that the figures are not really painting the whole picture. If we analyze the situation of large cities in big cities in Africa and Asia, well, we find theoretical discourses in favor of Islam as the only way, the only form of dwelling that the poor citizens can afford. Well, after the Spanish Civil War, we eliminated completely this problem. The slums, the shacks, shanty towns were completely eliminated, and now we find the city well crowded with homeless people. Even though the mayor of the city says that we have no longer poor people in Madrid. Well, I think that you said that inequality has decreased inside countries. And not between countries, but I thought it was the other way around. That equalities have remained stable or are quite similar between countries and has increased within each country. If we look at these indexes that you've mentioned, the hyper rich, have been immune from this phenomenon, but the ones that have suffered the most are the middle classes. Well, let me try to respond. As to the perceptions and beliefs, this made me think of Isaiah's Berlin, the power of ideas. When someone believes something, perceives that the distribution of wealth has worsened, because you can look at segments of society and point out that those who have lower income, lower purchasing power, etc. Well, sometimes the data are hard to swallow, but they cannot all be manipulated because they come from different sources, different bodies, and they are not so easy to manipulate. The fact that the Spanish society I'm sorry, but these ladies making comments without a microphone and we cannot hear them. In global terms, the Gini index in the year 2001 stood at 0.34. There's some inequality, but not really high. In 2007, after we joined the European Union 20 years ago, we joined the euro in 2001. In 2005, inequality decreased by 10 points. These are the times of growth, another golden age. Between 2007 and 2014, inequality increased as an aftermath of the crisis. And from 2014 to 2020, inequality has decreased again. These are the data, the hard, cold truth. The data. I'm not going to discuss here the perceptions of the Spanish economy. So, is there wealth distribution between the older citizens and the young ones? Yes, of course, but that does not mean that the Spanish society distribution of wealth in general in the last 7 years has worsened. It hasn't. Maybe it has not improved, but it has not worsened. A different thing is the distribution of wealth between different age segments or geographies, for that matter. What can I say about perception? I perceive a prosperous society, a society with a very high human development index, where whenever people are asked on surveys what is the best country to live, Spain is always among the top. So why is there such a perception that inequality has increased? I don't know, really. And it's quite surprising. In fact, I think this is a complaint of wealthy societies like France or Germany or the UK. It's true. We have the rich and we have the poor, but they are part of a wealthy society. Well, Elisa mentioned something that we've discussed before. There is a perception based on data among the young people that we are unequal. But at the same time, restaurants are full, bars are full, people go out on weekends, hotels are fully booked. So we live in a dual society. There have been people in Madrid who have been struggling during the pandemics, and there are people who live under extreme poverty. Among us, university professors, we believe that young students today favor the most extreme populist parties, the far right. Maybe this is what is radical for them. This is true change for them. When I was a student, it was completely the other way around. Young students in the political science university have completely different views of this. In the case of France, as Fernando mentioned, I think there is a discomfort, unhappiness, a malaise about many things, especially among the young people, because the young people, after all, are the ones who will have to pay the pensions. But in general, students of public universities are really radical in that respect. They favor the populist political parties and the extremists, especially the far right. Well, do we have questions from the online audience? Well, thank you for this interesting discussion. We have a question from Francisco Gómez Hernando. Equality in society can never be achieved because of the different intellectual capabilities. So what is the role of a state versus the individuals?
Y es que durante estos años, especialmente la pandemia, hemos visto que frente a esta aspiración de conseguir que la solidaridad sea una virtud pública,
after the pandemic or during the pandemic, solidarity was considered as a public virtue that needed to be disseminated. This has not been achieved. During the pandemic, there were demonstrations against the lockdowns or against the mandatory use of face masks. So the individual freedoms prevail over the freedom of society in general. So how should we respond to these? Well, there are many authors who emphasize the fact that solidarity emerges at times of crisis. When the crises are over, solidarity disappears. Well, there have been many cases of solidarity during the pandemic. Well, as to the use of the face mask, this is something that we find in the work of liberals like Hayek. In the case of pandemic, people need to be forced to use a face mask. It is mandatory. And it's obvious. I mean, I'm embarrassed to have to remind you that my freedom ends where the freedom of others starts. So if you don't use the face mask during a pandemic, you might be putting my life in danger. That is something that does not deserve any discussion, but there are some liberals who've accepted that we must use a mask. So can a liberal state make it mandatory to use a face mask? I would say yes. And that is the opinion of all liberal authors, by the way. As to the second question, it is a matter of equal opportunities. The question says there will not be equality because we have different intellectual capabilities. Of course, we're all different, and that is a fact, but the problem arises when there's a digital divide, or there are differences in the school or in the food you eat at home. Of course, the state cannot interfere into people's lives to that extent, and it shouldn't really, because there are things that we cannot control. If someone is more intelligent and has a better nature and better character than others, or has a stronger willpower, well, this is a territory in which the state cannot tread. Which is, I think it would be necessary to remove the obstacles for equality, to create opportunities, etc. Relations of the state with society and with the market change over time, and liberalism needed to and has adapted to the new realities. Capitalism is different because new technologies have changed everything, the way of working, everything. So the liberalism will need to adapt to that and will have to learn from its mistakes. I think there's a great psychological component as well, due to the transformations that you've mentioned. There has been a change in the very nature of middle classes. The traditional middle classes have lost some standing in society. New middle classes have emerged that are better prepared to face digitalization, globalization, etc. I think that the places where the new successful middle classes live and the rural areas, well, there's a huge contrast between these two, not only in economic terms, but also in psychological terms, because the rural population thinks we've been abandoned. And this is combined with the philosophy of the liberal device, namely the idea that money can buy everything. Michael Sandel's book, "What Money Can't Buy," is is an excellent example. What money shouldn't buy, maybe it would be a better title. In the past, public schools were very good, so the rich could attend the private schools. So the same applied to public housing, which was dignified enough as to not to have to envy the rich. So middle classes, things have changed, and the middle classes have found out that they don't have, they cannot afford to send their children to private schools. But if they send them to public schools, they will not be as competent as they need to be competitive later in life, because they have not received elite education, they have not been taught foreign languages, which is something that private schools have provided to their students. So, fear. What are we more afraid of? To delegate security on the shoulders of the state, or letting society be the one that searches for mechanisms to ensure solidarity, even though we know that only money can do that today? There is an excellent book that describes what the very wealthy have in mind, the plans that the very wealthy have in mind when the collapse comes, the new world war that will bring about the collapse of a society. There is a doctrine in France about the collapse. There's a very interesting series where we can see how the rich have organized a system that will fly them to remote islands where they will be fully protected, etc. So there are two mechanisms to allay the anxiety caused by fears. First, the state, the welfare state, and second, the Spinoza's or Montesquieu's model, in other words, or approach. What we should really be afraid of the state, because after all, the state is always despotic. So we don't trust the state and we don't trust the market, and that is the problem that we find ourselves in. And the liberals say, well, this is absolutely necessary, but to what extent are they willing to follow the orders or the recommendations of the health authorities? And then we have the Querdenker in Germany, those who think in the opposite way. In other words, what can we do about those people who do not believe anything that the science says, anything that is publicly recognized? I refuse to accept. So we're talking about pathologies here. Maybe, Pablo, we should not discuss whether there is a greater inequality or not, but how is inequality being reorganized between global cities and the periphery. And then there are some very important psychological elements as well. My generation in Spain lived in Sparta during the childhood. There was a scarcity, families with many children, without great consumption capacities. When you opened the fridge, you found a bottle of water, and that was it. Your younger brothers inherited the clothes from the older brothers. So we lived in Sparta. Gradually, little by little, we evolved into Athens. And our children, we went from Sparta to Athens, but our children have been educated in Athens, and they have the threats of Sparta down the line, and that is really tough. When the French, by the way, France is the country that allocates the greatest percentage of public expenditure to social expenditure, much more than Scandinavia. And there is no single developed state that has maintained retirement age at 62 years. So the more you have, the more you're outraged for losing something. That is indeed a psychological issue, because the problem is that when you get used to justice, it's very difficult to accept something different. John Rawls gave us some example. In Switzerland, it happened to me once when I was a smoker. If you lit up your cigarette with a match, you thought, well, I cannot just litter this match on the floor because everything is just so clean. So when something is clean, well, you don't feel like littering. So when we had an ethical rule, and that was just broken by the neoliberalism, well, we realized that the rich don't pay taxes because they have ways to avoid paying taxes. So when it's the workers who have to pay the taxes, they think, well, this is not fair, this is unjust. Well, there might be less inequality, but greater inequity. And the perception of inequity has increased for many different reasons. Regarding the states and the mistrust, distrust, disbelief about the state because it does not deliver what we think it should deliver. And it's disappointing us because you said it is not helping, the state is not protecting us. I think that the world has changed and we have not realized, as it was the case with the Industrial Revolution. What can the state do in a globalized world? Do we want the state to intervene and take care of us? Then this is not compatible with a globalized, with as Danny Rodriguez said, because in a globalized world, the state loses its power. In Spain, a state in Spain cannot do what it wants to do. It has transferred so many competences to a supranational body and voluntarily, because we are part members of a club of rich countries. The European Union has transferred fiscal policy, monetary policy, and many others to the European Union. What is better for us, high or low interest rates? Well, I don't know. Why should I worry about that? Because this is not my decision. Interest rates are going up because Brussels thinks that what is important here is inflation. Because it really has a negative impact on everyone every month, especially the poor. Of course, it has a negative impact on everyone. If I have 1 billion euros, well, I wouldn't be worried about 0.1 percent increase in the interest rate. Those who are paying a mortgage are more affected by the rise in interest rates. But I think we need to decide, do we want globalization, free movement of capital and people, or we want the state to say, well, yes, but to a certain extent. So we must decide. Most open democratic countries, and where there is a division of powers, and that is the key, have chosen globalization. Okay, we've chosen globalization, so let's not just expect that the state is going to protect us and to resolve all of our problems. A paternalistic state. And by the way, the contrast between Europe and the US. In the US, inequality is greater than in Western Europe, much, much greater, 0.4 versus 0.3 in Europe, in the Gini index. But the US society does not understand how the European society can afford two-digit unemployment rates. In the US, unemployment rates are much, much lower than in Europe. It can withstand greater inequality than in Europe, but not greater unemployment. However, European society can withstand inflation, unemployment rates of 12, 15, or even 20%. And this is quite paradoxical, this difference between the US and Europe. I think that the complaints about the state are ungrounded. I don't know why we have to choose between the state or the market. The state can do a lot of things in cooperation or in competition with the market or replacing the market in some cases. Many years ago, a survey was made among Spanish citizens who said that security was the greatest value. Justice was the second, I believe, but freedom was not in the top three. So people want security first and foremost. The news that bring about fear are the ones that have the greatest audiences. If you think you live in a world of terror, of course, people will demand safety. Just like Steven Pinker says in his book about the Enlightenment, he says we live in the safest time of history and we are more afraid than we've ever been. And that is the perception today, that we live in a terrifying world, even though we live in very safe societies, especially if you compare a situation with Lebanon or El Salvador or Honduras. So, safety comes first. And that is absolutely quintessential, to live without the threat of violence. Well, Robert Kaplan, he's a realist and pessimist, a reporter specialized in international relations, and he says in his book, what do you think was going to happen? You've had a great life, and now you realize that it's all coming to an end. Yeah, but that's why the young people don't want this to end. We want to have the same standard of living as our parents, and I think they're entitled. Okay, a young person. We got the final question. Well, thank you for the presentation. The idea of making statistics compatible with perception, I think it can be resolved three different ways. First, inequality has remained stable since the 90s. It has not increased, but maybe the inequality that exists today is strong enough to transcend the social basis of self-respect. Second, many of these countries, I come from Chile, in many countries economic policies are used to create a social state, and these maybe can be detrimental to social rights, and this creates a problem of uncertainty and low self-respect. And thirdly, inequalities became stable, but it is not expected to turn around. In Chile, in 2020, Gini index was 4.449 in Chile, but it increased 2 points 2 years later. And not only that, but there are some policies which apparently seek to dismantle the social state. This could make this index.
Bueno, pues, es un buen comentario. Es un buen comentario, sí, señor. Pues muchísimas gracias y un aplauso a nuestros magníficos ponentes. Y el lunes que viene seguiremos hablando de estos temas, ¿eh?